funciona? Crec que no, no? Ah, no? Ara sí. Molt bé. Doncs molt bona tarda. Molt benvinguts a tots vosaltres a la inauguració del que serà l'Aula Mediterrània d'aquest any. Estem molt contents de comptar avui i d'estar avui amb un dels màsters pioners també amb tota aquesta iniciativa que porta el professor Ricard Zapata i amb la intervenció del professor Chambers. Avui comencem una trajectòria que durarà, vaja, tot uns mesos, on tenim 23 professors que vindran a participar i a parlar en unes conferències que hem organitzat gràcies a la intervenció i a la col·laboració de 12 màsters aquí a Barcelona, que de seguida està dit, comptar amb 12 estudis sobre la Mediterrània a Barcelona. Hem obert aquest any, a més, amb 2 màsters visitants, que diem nosaltres, a fora de Barcelona, de Tarragona i Girona, i així obrim també la possibilitat que a partir de l'any que ve aquest màster pugui seguir per tota Catalunya. També tenim un agermanament amb Casa Àrabe a Madrid, on també es fa l'Aula Àrabe i on en aquests moments també ens estan seguint per Zoom i per streaming. Per tant, hem intentat fer tot el nostre esforç per poder donar suport a les iniciatives universitàries de coneixement amb diferents disciplines de la Mediterrània a casa nostra. Pensem, estem convençuts de l'Institut Europeu de la Mediterrània, que la Mediterrània existeix. Pensem que existeix precisament perquè existeixen actors que treballen en aquest àmbit, que s'interessen, però sobretot existeix perquè quan hi ha pensament, hi ha anàlisi, hi ha acadèmia, vol dir que hi ha alguna cosa a estudiar. Per tant, a tots aquells que avui, em sembla que avui amb aquesta conferència tindrem, és la millor apertura per preguntar-nos què estem estudiant, què estem analitzant. És molt pertinent també avui, i cal dir, i és un repte que tenim associat a tot això amb les actuals circumstàncies. Sabem que més ara que mai hem d'entendre i hem de continuar treballant. El fet que sigui una àrea tan difícil d'entendre o tan dificultosa a nivell dels reptes que presenten no vol dir que no tinguin no només l'interès, sinó potser la possibilitat de mirar i de fer les coses d'una manera. Per què nosaltres des de l'Institut estem tan empenyats, no sé, tan committed, ara perquè volia parlar mig en anglès, mig en català, però per què volem estar tan compromesos? Per què estem tan compromesos amb la recerca? Perquè com a think tank nosaltres ja analitzem. Tenim les nostres xarxes, tenim una xarxa que es diu Euromesco, que és la xarxa més important d'instituts de tota la Mediterrània treballant sobre polítiques euromediterrànies, publiquem un anuari que veu aquí, tenim revistes que analitzen l'actualitat, treballem amb els millors experts, d'aquí un mes organitzem el FIMAM, que és el Congrés d'Arabistes Espanyols, que també tindrà lloc a Barcelona. Sí, però nosaltres no només volem encoratjar l'anàlisi, volem encoratjar la recerca i volem encoratjar les noves metodologies de recerca que ens ajuden a comprendre el que està passant. Per això tenim aliances amb laboratoris, com diria jo que és el GRITIM, perquè ens interessa treballar molt amb laboratoris acadèmics que aposten no només amb el que estudiem, sinó a millorar la manera de com ho fem. I per això necessitem els joves investigadors d'avui ben preparats, perquè sereu els que canviaran també les mirades sobre les coses. Jo porto 40 anys, gairebé tants com aquest senyor, potser una mica menys que el conferenciant, amb aquesta àrea i amb aquesta regió, i us puc assegurar que les mirades i instruments canvien. I el que abans era estudis d'una mirada determinada, ara es complexifica i ara es diversifica. Però hem de ser competitius amb aquestes mirades i hem d'ajudar a que aquestes noves mirades que sou vosaltres ens ajudin a prendre decisions. A l'IEMed som un think and do tank. Vol dir que tot el que fem va destinat a ajudar les polítiques ja siguin dels nostres consorciats, des dels locals amb l'Ajuntament de Barcelona fins a la Generalitat de Catalunya, però també al Ministeri, i sobretot, el nostre commitment va sobretot a les polítiques europees a la regió i a les polítiques sobretot euromediterrànies. Estem molt contents de l'aula, aquest any hem posat molts esforços per visibilitzar la gran feina que fan els nostres, promotors, les persones que ajuden a que hi hagi estudiants que vulguin apuntar-se a estudiar coses perquè tenen qualitat i interès, i pensem també, sobretot, que el que podem oferir és un entorn d'intercanvi. Per això aquest any hem apostat molt per posar a disposició de grans formats digitals, obrim el podcast Aula també, i per tant esperem que la reflexió sigui part de l'opinió. Veiem també amb el que està passant, hi ha lloc per tots, però aquest vol ser un lloc d'anàlisi, i per tant la qualitat del pensament que volem donar. Sabeu que donem premis als millors treballs de màster, també a finals de la... Us encoratgem també a que feu i a que us presenteu amb aquests premis. Fem un seminari el mes de març que aquest any recolzarem i millorarem i donarem molt de contingut, perquè no només treballarem el que són els continguts de la recerca, sinó que també procurarem treballar el que és l'intercanvi acadèmic i recolzar i fer també conjuntament amb l'Aula Àrabe a Madrid una reflexió sobre cap a on anem amb la reflexió mediterrània i del món àrab. I finalment, d'una manera deliberada, nosaltres no tractem un tema, l'aula és molts temes. Avui tenim l'èmfasi en migracions, de fet aquest any migracions serà una gran part de les conferències que han estat proposades des dels màsters, però també tenim història, també tenim política, geopolítica i temes molt actuals. Què volem amb aquesta mirada polièdrica i interdisciplinària? Volem encoratjar-vos també a vosaltres que participeu als altres màsters, que visiteu la web on tindrem actius tots els vídeos i totes les conferències, que us il·lumineu fora de la vostra àrea de competència i que això doni també una certa, dinàmica i també pugueu conèixer a persones interessants d'altres iniciatives. Well, I think I speak in Catalan that you, for sure, you understand perfectly, no? Coming from an Italian, I'm so sorry, but it seems to me that it was a little bit necessary also to provide you the idea where we are. We are placed here in Barcelona, in Catalonia, so here is, for all of you, here is your institution, and we are hoping that with this great initiative from GRITIM to invite Professor Chambers today, you have a good enlightening of whatever it will be our idea of the Mediterranean. So thank you very much for coming to all of you, and thank you again for this good starting point of the Aula. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Gemma, for these wonderful words and framing of everything, and a good opportunity also for the students to know more in details what IEMed is doing and what are the main challenges he has taken. I'm very happy to have the opportunity to open this Aula Mediterrània conference series organized by IEMed, which is now a consolidated event in Barcelona with the coordination of almost all the universities, 12 within the Catalan spectrum. And to do it with Professor Chambers on the topic that is consubstantial both to the philosophies of IEMed and GRITIM-UPF and the platform that I myself coordinate, EuroMedMich, bridging the Mediterranean with human mobilities and migrations. If an open lecture is always an opportunity to offer an argument, a narrative that can frame the whole seminar series, this one is particularly important for us, to take the Mediterranean as a category of analysis in itself and to make an epistemological effort to break down given assumptions and offer new paths of interpretation. Identifying epistemological barriers is important because it allows us to identify power relations, inequalities, cultural prejudices, and even ideologies that frame the Mediterranean and the human mobilities today, that take place today and are part also of the Mediterranean heritage. The work of Iain Chambers is particularly interesting because it opens this reflective tone in the Mediterranean migration studies, with a special effort to think the Mediterranean in a different and alternative way, free, if it is possible, I will say, from political, cultural, and even social prejudices, often linked to our collective memory, shaped, as we know, by geopolitical interest in the Mediterranean. Chambers' works highlight the power dynamics and inequalities inherent in the Mediterranean migration, challenging conventional Western thinking and offering alternative perspectives. What we learn from Iain Chambers is the importance of including multiple voices in thinking about the Mediterranean and interpreting human mobilities, because if knowledge is to be produced, it must be the result of interaction, free from power relation on unequal terms. An argument from the north and the south and the east must have equal value. This also involves breaking the mechanisms that often hierarchize the concept of migration on the Mediterranean. It is great effort that Chambers has been making for several years. In fact, and with his approval, Iain Chambers is probably one of the current scholars who follow the broader Iain heritage of considering the Mediterranean as a category of analysis. He also thinks of the Mediterranean in the medium and long term, avoiding short terms. He has a special ability to theorize Mediterranean analytically, combining the dimension of time and space, something that may be related to a Mediterranean chronotope, chronos on topos. Iain Chambers is a cultural theorist and scholar known for his work on Mediterranean post-colonial studies. He has written a lot extensively on the subject, exploring the challenges and complexity of migration in the Mediterranean. By examining the intersection of migration, culture, and politics, Chambers provides a comprehensive analysis of Mediterranean migrations. One of Chambers' most notable works is, I fully recommend you, Mediterranean Crossings, in which he examines the politics and dynamics of migration from the southern and northern shores. The book offers a critical analysis on what he calls himself the interrupted modernity of the region, and offers, in its one term, a disquieting account when he speaks in terms of migration. Iain Chambers' evocative volume argues that the Mediterranean, both as a concept and a historical and cultural formation, is imaginatively constructed by the interaction of many cultures that border its waters. Chambers also explored the phenomenon of identity in the Mediterranean and the ways in which migration and mobility shapes and influence it. Overall, Chambers' analysis offers a critical and thought-provoking perspective on Mediterranean migrations, shedding light on the historical, social, and political forces that shape migration patterns and experiences. His work challenges the dominant narratives surrounding migration in the Mediterranean, and we must all consider ourselves fortunate he has accepted our kind invitation. Now it is time to listen and learn from his presentation. The floor is yours today.
Okay. Okay, well, first of all, I want to thank Ricard and Gemma for inviting me to speak this evening. I'm going to try and suggest there are ways, if I speak too fast, slow me down, okay? I'm going to try and suggest ways of thinking not so much of migration and the Mediterranean as objects of study, but trying to think with them, trying to think with the Mediterranean and migration as historical processes which introduce us to a much more complicated, much more complex understanding of what the Mediterranean is, and poses a series of critical challenges, both politically, historically, and culturally. So it's also about trying to understand history as a complex constellation, not something which is simply chronological, but is rather, I would suggest, a constellation in which history somehow doesn't pass, but accumulates. That past accumulates in the present with a series often of unanswered questions. It doesn't go away. It continues to insist. And it often, we register this above all when thinking about those histories which our version of history, our version of the Mediterranean, has tended to exclude or refuse. Just to think of the Mediterranean being composed of three shores with all its histories and cultures. There's the European shore, which over the last 200 years has become the dominant one, which has defined and even invented the idea of the Mediterranean in many ways. And then there's 2/3 of the Mediterranean composed of Africa and Asia with its histories and cultures. So it's about thinking about reintroducing those other elements, those other histories into the picture, which is not simply doing a work of addition. It's not simply taking, okay, we have history of the Mediterranean, our history, and now perhaps we should listen to other histories and add them. The moment you bring in these other histories, these other cultures, we have to rethink the very premises of the Mediterranean, the very premises of history. In other words, it raises questions about power and politics. Simply put, who has the right to narrate? Who has the right to decide, to define the Mediterranean? Of course, the last 200 years, it's us, Europeans, who tended to define and exercise that right politically and culturally and through historiography. But we also know there are deeper histories where others have also offered other narrations, other histories in the Mediterranean, which come through and which continue to exist and persist. Perhaps that's one of the ways of thinking about what's happening right now in Palestine, Israel. So I'll come to that in a minute. So it's to think about, as I say, not understanding historical processes is simply in terms of, how can I put it, dualisms. It's not simply there's hegemonic or a dominant history, our history, and then there's other histories underneath, but rethinking the very nature of the historiographical understanding of the Mediterranean. So it's, as I put it here, it's something to do about reopening the archives, and not treating the past as past, but considering the past as part of the constitution of the present. And I put here, unwinding, this is very much like, as a disc jockey would do it, right? Unwinding history and playing it again. So taking the established score, the musical score of historiography, and going back and replaying it so it allows other histories, other voices, other accents, other rhythms to emerge and to appear. Which then, as I say, challenges what I call the Occidental clock of the colonization of space-time. Occidental clock, because we've all been taught to think of history as a linear process under the power of progress. That today is inevitably going to be better than yesterday, and tomorrow will be better than today. This sort of linear unfolding of historical time. And it suggests that historical time doesn't operate in a chronological fashion. It operates in a much more complicated way. There are other rhythms, there's multiple rhythms, and the past can return. The past can return, and if that past has not been registered or recognized by us, that past comes to us from the future, because it's still to be registered. So to think about these much more complicated constellations of history. Now I'm going to do this by playing you a video sequence where you see two scenes shot in the same place. You see a scene taken from the film by Luchino Visconti, Il Gattopardo. It's a famous scene of a dancing scene where you see European aristocrats, the Sicilian aristocrats dancing in the ballroom. And then underneath it, there's the same place, the same location is used for where we see migrants, contemporary migrants from sub-Saharan Africa, dancing performing a dance of death in the same building, Palazzo Gangi in Palermo. So it's a repetition of the scene for Visconti is repeated to release other histories, other cultures, another set of questions.
Tancredi è proprio un amore. E anche lei è un amore, lo sa.
Meno male che Tancredi non sente quelle così.
Dico davvero, sì. So di dover dire. Anche Tancredi lo crede. Perché se lei non avesse voluto, certamente finiva.
Finiva che Tancredi ti avrebbe sposato lo stesso. Eri tutta a te sola.
No, non è vero.
Sì, è vero, Angelica. Nessun Tancredi avrebbe resistito alla tua bellezza.
Avevo sentito dire di lei che era un buon ballerino, principe.
Mi dispiace di averti ancora delusa.
È molto di più di un buon ballerino. Lei è un ballerino delizioso, veramente delizioso.
Ma sì, è mio padre.
E proprio.
La mazurka allora.
Mi stanno guardando tutti, principe.
Che splendida ragazza che parla con suo padre.
È molto, molto bello.
Gli applausi non sono scrosciati è solo perché è un leone della tua specie in cui per rispetto non incoraggia sconvenienze. Ma ti meritavi un'ovazione.
E ora dai.
So what we see underneath by Isaac Julian, who's a black British filmmaker, it's a video installation called Western Union, Small Boats. Western Union being the agency you use to send money back home, wherever home is. Small boats being the small boats that seek to cross the Mediterranean every night. What we see here is a sort of replay or repetition of Europe in the terms of the European cinema canon, neorealism, Italian cinema, ideas of beauty and aesthetics, including, it's very beautiful, Isaac Julian's video installation as well. So the repetition of the languages of Europe, aesthetically, culturally, historically, releases another history, allows other voices, others to come in and insist on their right to narrate. So it's not simply about a history from below, it's about changing the very coordinates, changing the coordinates of understanding historical processes, which have tended, are historical processes which have tended to exclude others or marginalize others in order that our version of the Mediterranean, including our understanding of migration, passes as unique, as the only one. And then to think about the Mediterranean in terms of what it is, the Mediterranean materially, the sea, to think about it as liquid. So to think about fluid and extensive archives which are suspended in water, those bodies which don't make it across the Mediterranean, those people who die at sea in the cemetery of the Mediterranean, the salt in their blood is destined to circulate for hundreds of thousands of years. So when you swim in the Mediterranean, you're swimming in that shared archive, those other histories, even though we may not register it. So to think about how that also connects, for example, to arguments we made about thinking about the modern Atlantic, the famous book by Paul Gilroy, The Black Atlantic, where thinking about the centrality of slavery to the making of modernity and Occidental society and its democratic institutions. To think about that, and that connects, in a way, how Paul Gilroy reworks the understanding of the Atlantic, the modern Atlantic, from below, from the point of view of the slaves, those who have been excluded, which adds a complexity, which means you have to rethink the very nature of modernity. What is modernity when slavery is central to its making? What is modernity? When slavery is essential to its making. Not something, not just a terrible historical moment that happened back there, but it continues to operate in the making the Constitution of the present. Black lives matter today. Black lives matter. That comes out of history, that deep history, those deep histories. So we could think about registering this marine world, the Black Atlantic, today's Black Mediterranean, as essential to the making of modernity. From slave ships and seaborne empires, Spain, Portugal, France, Holland, Great Britain, from those seaborne empires to container logistics and the industrialized extraction of resources, from fish to fossil fuels, and with that, the centrality of migration to modernity. From 1500 onwards, the centrality of migration. Modernity is in many ways, or migration is in many ways, the history of modernity. So what we find in all of this is the brutal consistency and continuum of colonialism in the haunting racism that produces the violent grammar of inhospitality, today etched in the hieroglyphics of flesh, hortenses, spillers, on the body of the contemporary migrant. This interrupts and reworks the terracentric, thinking about how to think when you're no longer rooted in the soil, but go offshore, find yourself at sea, perhaps a bit lost. Interrupts and reworks the terracentric Occidental template of historiography, sociology, and philosophy, and punctuates their faith in rendering the world transparent to their will, as though only we have the key to understanding modernity and the making of the modern world. So from the Black Atlantic to the Black Mediterranean, and here, these to insist upon, these are not separate historical moments, but come together in a shared historical constitution of the present, in a shared historical constellation. So we have famous pictures of the slave ships, the rationalization of labor, the space on a slave ship to fit in as many slaves as possible coming from the west coast of Africa to the Americas, 1700s or 1800s. On the left there, we have Italian migrants leaving from, I don't know, Geneva or Napoli, Naples, going to Buenos Aires at the beginning of the 20th century, and we have the situation today. So to think about how those elements are actually held together in a shared constellation in which migration is central to the making of modernity. So from the Black Mediterranean to from the Black Atlantic to the Black Mediterranean, seas of dispossession and unbelonging. Migrants do not have a status, do not have rights. This has constantly exposed colonial modernity's political, juridical, and onto-epistemological limits. The migrant promotes a constant critique of the possessive liberal premises of Western democracy. Today, those on the water in their small boats and dinghies, the wretched of the sea, the damned of the Mediterranean, cannot source their identity in the nation-state's territory. Justice fails. Without papers or documents to verify their liberty, they are captives. They are captives. Objects, not subjects, objects reduced to the anonymous juridical space. After all, it's we who created the concept of the illegal migration. Nobody's born illegally. It's created by us. Western Occidental jurisdiction has created the illegal migrant. Without papers or documents to verify their liberty, they are captives. Objects reduce to the anonymous juridical space once occupied by the enslaved. Without rights, they are without an acknowledged place in the world. Waste. Which, of course, also sets up a resonance thinking about the contemporary situation of Palestinians today. Waste in the forms of understanding the territory of a nation state, who is part of it and who is excluded from it. So beyond this very well-known Italian philosopher, Giorgio Agamben, beyond his noted thesis of bare life, the migrant proposes the exceptional state that exposes the limits of European humanism and its custody of universal rights. What are these rights when they're not extended to everybody? But we say they are universal and that we deny them to others. We are taken to the edges of the abyss, or instead to the beach, to embark and navigate beyond Agamben's and much of modern philosophy, for which philosophy is the West and the West is philosophy. That's a totalizing vision of what philosophy is about. For the migrant, the non-white body, even if mute and lifeless, strips away the political and philosophical paradigm of Europe. Her presence interrogates my authority on the world. This perhaps explains the fear and the violence of the response. Our authority being put in question. The autonomy of migrants practicing all the difficulties of freedom below and beyond the violent confines of the nation state bends and breaks the established frontiers of identity and citizenship. So over time it's interrogating, who has the right for citizenship, why, on what basis, how did that come about historically and culturally? Today, the migrant reiterates Frantz Fanon's request to demand human behavior from the other. We, and I, am that other, demanding human behavior from us. This takes us to a planetary humanism that, as Aimé Césaire and Fanon insisted, is to be measured against the world, and not merely Europe and the West. So when we talk about democracy, citizenship, to think about it in a worldly frame, a worldly measure, and not simply in terms of the West and Europe. So this is not simply about histories from below or presumed peripheries reconfiguring the centers of power in their languages. On the contrary, introducing non-authorized coordinates, Black Atlantic, Black Mediterranean, thinking at sea, thinking with the sea, introducing this forces us to acknowledge the violent denial that constitutes our present. That is to query the temporality and terminology of the inherited narrative and its institutional pedagogies. Sociology, anthropology, historiography, their premises are put in question. Rather than an adjustment through the recovered, the refused, and the repressed, we confront a radical undoing and reconfiguring of what we understand by terms, such as history, documents, archives, testimony, and memory, as we ask who has the right to narrate, who has the right to define, direct, and explain, who has the right to have rights, Hannah Arendt. So I'm now going to go very quickly, after that sort of premise, very quickly through a series of images to try and illustrate this. So the idea then is thinking, not simply, as I said, reducing others, migrants, other histories, other cultures to objects, but thinking with them as open-ended processes. So thinking with, through, and beyond the subaltern souths, how they raise questions that interrogate us and perhaps raise questions about our authority on the world. This is a classic map of the colonial Mediterranean. Up until 70 years ago, the southern and eastern shores of the Mediterranean were directly controlled from three European capitals, from London, Paris, and Rome. The whole of North Africa and what's so-called Middle East was all directly controlled from those three European capitals. It's not that long ago. So to think about that, the colonial constitution of the Mediterranean, which we can think about it beginning about 200 years ago and the struggle for world hegemony between British and French forces and the sea battles in the Mediterranean and so on, but how it forms part of a colonial continuum and is not simply a moment, a historical moment as back there, but it continues to constitute the very nature of the present. Continues to constitute the very nature of the present. What we're witnessing right now, and have been witnessing also for over 70 years in that part of the world, which of course, well, I'll come back to that in a minute, which of course bears the responsibility here is not simply about Israel, it's about Europe, about the West, and how it's divided up the world and decided who can be part of it and who should not be part of it. And this, we find the same thing here. We find the same thing here. This is from Frontex, the European organization, which is supposed to control, manage migration. And we find the same colonization of space and time. The Mediterranean is European property, Mare Nostrum. It's the European authorities, Frontex, who define what it is. The same way as foodstuffs produced for European markets in North Africa have to follow European Union rules about how big zucchini are and so on. But so Europe extends its jurisdiction right across the sea into North Africa. So it's all part of that colonial constitution. It's not. This is not to. This is to try and register things which are very complicated. At the same time, it helps us perhaps to begin to constitute another way, another history of the Mediterranean, which is not simply that linear or that geopolitical mapping of existing forces and trying to explain it, but trying to think about how the explanations lie in much deeper, much more complicated layers. So this is the final thing, to insist upon this idea of the historical or the colonial constitution of the present. On the top right up there, we have the Battle of the Pyramids, 1798, where Napoleon Bonaparte and French troops conquer the ex-Ottoman province of Egypt. And this is like the beginning of that modern European colonization of the Mediterranean, because Napoleon took with him not simply troops, but also he took with him artists, scientists, the idea of being able to map the territory, to render it completely transparent to European knowledge and European power. So it's not simply about military conquest or economic gain. It's about the full appropriation of the world. It's a full ongoing colonial enterprise. And then underneath we have the construction, or you can say the invention of the Middle East. It's called the Middle East because it's halfway between London and Delhi. That's why it's the Middle East. So, you know, from an imperial center outwards, looking outwards, and that's the division between the French and British mandates in what is today Syria, Palestine, Israel, Jordan, and so on. And it was this management and the division of this territory and its eventual division into modern nation states by the British and the French, which may be part of the complexities and part of the problems we're living through today. And then on the left, we have a young girl from Iraq, from Syria, from the war, ongoing civil war in Syria. This is 2016 on the Greek island of Lesbos, who's arriving in Europe. And what I want to suggest is that these things are interconnected. They're not separate moments in time. They're deeply interconnected. The colonial carving up of the world, the management of it all, so it respects and responds to European interests, creates a situation of this type, this nature. So it's not simply out there or what's it got to do with us. It's everything to do with us. It's everything to do with who we are and how we've been constituted historically, culturally, and politically. Then, just a very banal thing, this maps of absence is to think about the Mediterranean as I said, liquid archives, but also deeper archives, deeper histories, more profound histories, is to register that there have been other Mediterraneans, or even that the idea of the Mediterranean did not exist in the way we understand it. But it has known this space, this basin, the Mediterranean, has been under the powers of other histories, other cultures, other languages. So we go back to a world system. This could be called a world system in the 13th century, when the world was organized, or the center of the world, and the world cities at the time were certainly not Madrid or Paris or London, but they were Baghdad and Cairo. And these circuits are circuits of trade, but obviously circuits of trade are also circuits of culture. And the more dense they are, you know, the deeper it is. So we see where we find Europe very much in the periphery of the world in the 13th century. And perhaps, you know, many people have argued that the European Crusades were not simply motivated by religion, but also by the periphery trying to gain access to the riches of the then so-called civilized world, which is dominated by Islam. Okay. So to think these other maps, reintroducing these other maps, already begins to disturb some of the coordinates. To think about, for example, Islam has been present longer in some parts of Europe than Christianity. If Islam enters Europe in 712, with the arrival of Berber troops under Arab commanders in southern Spain, there were parts of what are today the Baltic states which practiced paganism until the 13th century. The Order of the Teutonic Knights was founded, above all, for crusades against pagans in what is today would be Poland and the Baltic states. Or in Uppsala in Sweden, human sacrifice was practiced until the 11th century, every 7 years. So Islam has a continuity, a longer presence in Europe, some parts of Europe than Christianity in other parts. So again, it raises important questions, it seems to me, about how we think about these things. And then we have the most powerful political power in Europe in the 17th century. And it was considered to be so in the 17th century, the Ottoman Empire. And all the traces that has left and leaves in the Balkans, contemporary Greece and so on. So bringing these other maps into play is to create a sort of stratification, a sedimentation of other maps, which mean our way of mapping can be put in question, it can be rewritten and reorganized in the light of other histories, of these absent maps, which are also maps of power, of course. Venice's quote I've taken from his very famous British historian called David Abulafia, teaches at the University of Cambridge, and this book called A Human History of the Mediterranean, which is a gigantic book of about 500 pages. It begins with the first records of human occupation in the Mediterranean and goes through to the present, and it's presented as a very linear narrative, and the opening pages of the book, he writes, the Mediterranean we now know was shaped by Phoenicians, so back 500 years before, 800 years before, the Common Era, Greeks and Etruscans in antiquity, by Genoese, Venetians and Catalans, oh there you go, in the Middle Ages, by Dutch...
Not always the right.
Yeah, well, we're not going to get... Yeah, well, none of these are right. By Dutch, English and Russian navies in the centuries before 1800. Well, I just want to point out, if you take away the Phoenicians, everybody's European. The whole history of the Mediterranean is European in this narrative. White and European. There are no Arabs, no Islam, no Ottoman Empire. Really? It's a very... Well, anyway. I think it's intellectual nonsense, what's said there. But yeah. So I think just to think about that, it's not quite that simple, David. Okay. So this is an image taken from inside a tomb. This is part of Greek colonization, the Greek colonization of the Mediterranean, which again we talked, this is the beginning of civilizations. It spread from classical Greece around the Mediterranean. But of course it involved conquest, involved bloody conquest of territories, involved imposition of your way of life, your way of thinking upon others around the Mediterranean, whether that's in Sicily, southern Italy, Spain. Greek colonization arrived also parts of North Africa. And to think, this thinking with the diver, this is inside the tomb. It is found at Paestum, which is about 120 kilometers south of Naples. This painting was actually never to be seen because it's inside the lid of the tomb, which when it's closed, that was it. But it was discovered in 1968. But what is interesting is it's a very dark body, right? It's a very dark body. It's probably a slave diving into the eternity of the sea. But this raises another question about how, when we think about colonization, the Greek colonization, how we think about the so-called classical past, which is always presented as the origins of our culture, our history, how it's always presented as a very sort of white version, very white version. This, of course, is an invention of 18th century Hellenism, particularly by German scholars, but everybody's followed it since. So above there we have the Acropolis in Athens, as it is today, all white and gleaming white marble. But actually at the time it was all painted. It was painted in very garish colours, even what many of us would consider rather kitsch. There's a sort of recreation underneath of what the temple of Jove might have looked like at the time, the painting, because they've discovered the pigments of the painting. But we have this image of the classical Greece as white, pure, as though it's a sort of the pure origins of Europe. Which brings us to that, the White House, which these days carries a lot of disturbing ideas, right? The White House after Donald Trump, but I never find Donald Trump, Black Lives Matter, the White House. Okay, so inside the Acropolis, there was, of course, because, that part of the world was part of the Ottoman Empire. the Acropolis was badly damaged, not by the Ottomans, but by Venetians fighting the Ottomans in 1683. It was badly damaged. But inside the Acropolis, there was also a mosque. So this idea of a stratification, sedimentation of histories, like the maps I was showing you before, creates a much more complicated, a much more agonistic understanding of the Mediterranean, not simply a clean, laid-out map which respects our geopolitical interests, but something much more antagonistic, much more agonistic. And what's happened, they've been cleaning up the access, the way to reach the top of the Acropolis to make it more accessible. And they removed all the sedimentation. These are Muslim tombs that were on the inside the Acropolis, which has been thrown away in the rubbish. Yeah. And so it's not acknowledged. It's the idea you can return to the roots, pure roots, uncontaminated by the Ottomans, uncontaminated by what's happened in the last 2,000 years, and get back to those roots, which of course is a deep ideological proposal, which is all about who we are as Greeks and Europeans, as white, pure, uncontaminated by these other cultures. And this also feeds in, of course, into the whole language and syntax which we use when we talk about others, whether they're migrants or people from sub-Saharan Africa and so on. So it feeds into that ideology of what Europe is and what European is as though there's fixed and static roots rather than a continual elaboration of what I would call the other roots, which are R-O-U-T-E-S, the continual elaboration of historical processes in which the Ottomans, Islam, Arabs are also part of the constitution of the making of modern Europe. And then I'm going to, how am I doing for time? Am I okay?
I forget.
You forget? Okay. So
we have 15 minutes.
Okay.
But we need to have a
okay.
If you finish, we can have a talk.
Yeah, okay, I'll finish. So the other thing I want to introduce then, and then I'll finish on this, is the idea of using other languages to think with the Mediterranean, using other languages to think with modernity, which means, again, breaking apart the usual disciplinary distinctions. You know, when we talk about the Mediterranean, then we need to have historiography or anthropology or sociology. What I tend to do, and I like to do, is to introduce things like music, to think about Mediterranean musicality. Because if you think with music, you're not bound to national confines, national frontiers. You're not bound to linguistic limits. Music travels without being authorized. It travels all around the Mediterranean. So we can hear often in the sounds another history. Another history is suspended in the sound. A much more complicated history. I was going to play you, but the technology didn't permit it. A sequence from a film called Vengo by the Rom director Tony Gatliff, where we see two groups of musicians playing together. One group is led by Tomatito, the flamenco player, and the other is by a group from El Cairo, Sufi musicians. And they start off playing separately, and then they play together. They sort of improvise together. And it's a form of re-proposing, like the Isaac Julian video we saw at the beginning, opening up the archive, where the past returns in a recomposition, a new composition, and a reconfiguration of the present, in which there is north and south, the northern shore of the Mediterranean, southern shore of the Mediterranean, so-called Oriental part, represented by Sheikh Al-Tuni and his Sufi musicians, and the western part, Tomatito and the flamenco, how these are all brought together in creating another configuration of the present, an open-ended set of processes in which what tend to be put back or cancelled returns with a new set of questions. It returns to question us. But what I'm going to do, I'm going to conclude with a short musical performance by a Palestinian oud player and singer called Camila Joubran. She sings, well, she'll be singing in Arabic, and she sings in Arabic, which, if you think about it, in all its variations and dialects, is the first language of the Mediterranean, Arabic, right? In all its variations. So, I mean, just to think about that, follow the sounds here, is already to open up another way of configuring the Mediterranean, which is not under modernity, she's also very modern in the way she sings. She's very much involved in sort of avant-gardist Arab music making. Is to think about that, think about a modernity which is not simply mine, yours, ours, which exists and persists without our authorization. So we'll just listen to Camila.
منحدرا من الجبل يعدو حصانك خببا تاركا آثار حوافر ذهبية في جسد الغيمة الشاردة جرا وراءه ذيله الكبريتي الطويل كطائرة بعيون تبرق في العتبة السماوات بفناراتها المهجورة تلقي بظلالها فوق قوافل سائرة إلى متاهاتها. بعيون من جمر تقود قوتنا أبدا نحن الماضين إلى مدن المستقبل بلا حقائب السفر غاسلة أوجهنا بمائنا عها السلسبيل كاشفة عريانا المقدسة.
So, music as a critical language, in other words, not the history or sociology of music, but music as history, music as sociology, which, you know, to introduce those ways of thinking about sound and the archives, the histories sustained and suspended in sound is, of course, to disturb the usual understandings of what we mean by history or historiography. So, we can now have a debate.
Thank you. Thank you, Iain, for the open our minds in many ways, and mixing time and space and interaction, temporality, and many other issues. And now it's time to also to the Q and A moment. If you have some questions, clarifications, suggestions, criticism, react. It's time to react, yeah. And to have the opportunity to have an immediate answer.
Perhaps.
If you intervene, then please introduce yourself as you think. Sometimes by nationality, sometimes by studies. Please react. Okay, who are you?
Hello, my name is Noah, and I study the Master's degree of Migration Studies here in Barcelona. Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation. So, yeah, I was, like, throughout the presentation, I was thinking a lot about what you said about that, like, yeah, who gets the right to have rights, but also to narrate, yeah, to make history, actually. And, like, yeah, that there's the need to maybe perceive, yeah, the Mediterranean from a completely different perspective and with different concepts, and that we need to reflect on actually everything we have in our sciences or the concepts we use, maybe. And I was just a bit wondering what, sorry if I'm a bit, if it's not super clear what I mean, but I'm just wondering, like, how can, yeah, we as well, like I, for example, as someone socialized in the global north with a very Occidental perspective, what role could I have in that regard, or is it at all possible from my perspective, for example, to get to a point where I can take another perspective, right, and actually,
right.
So I was just wondering what your approach towards this is, like, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Do you want to act, and then you take others?
Well, that's a very important question, because it's about, as you say, and as I try to say as well, it's about first of all registering the asymmetrical relationships of power which structure the modern world. What can we do about that? Well, we can't. I want to quote from the famous Algerian novelist Assir Jabbar, which we can't speak for or in the name of the other. So I can't speak for the subaltern souths of the world. But what I can do is perhaps register the limits of my language, which means register the limits of my critical language as well, which apparently operates as being universally valid. My historiography, my philosophy is considered to be universally valid, but we know it comes out of a particular historical and geographical space, and it's become universal through, it's colonized the planet, because colonization is not simply about economic power, it's about the power of thought, about intellectual power, which is registered as being intellectually valid everywhere. So it's about undoing that, and I think we can, registering our limits means also undoing that. It means undoing a whole inheritance we have, which comes out of Western philosophy, the Kantian reduction of others to objects of apparently scientific neutral study, which we know is not really neutral or scientific, because it's always mirroring back to us what we hope to see, or reconfirming us in our humanity, in our democracy, and so on, and through reducing others to objects. So I think it's about registering limits. It's also about moving beyond what I would call the visual politics. The maps are all about visuality. Apparently we can locate everything and everybody on a map and thereby explain it. Moving beyond visual politics to a politics of listening, which means sometimes we have to shut up and listen. And how to think how that impacts upon our own historical and cultural formation. I mean, we can't cancel, we can't cancel who we are, but we can reconfigure that. We reconfigure our histories, and with it reconfigure ourselves in the light of what our histories have denied, negated, often in very violent forms. But thank you for the question. That is the question, yeah.
Thank you. More questions? Formulate question as a matter of interview. Huh? You have the opportunity to interview Iain Chambers today. What you will ask him?
Hello.
Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Who are you? Sorry for that.
I'm Eva. I'm not associated with any of the masters. I'm just a friend of a student, and I visited out of interest. I'm actually Greek, and it's not a question, it's more of a deepening of your comment. Throughout I studied architecture, so I had to study a lot of art history, and, architecture history, etc. But within my schooling, even the idea of European values centered in the classical era is kind of whitewashing, because ancient Greeks colonized the Mediterranean region in different stages, and actually the Greek language is a direct descendant of Phoenician, the alphabet, everything.
Sure.
So ancient Greeks were not white.
Right,
actually, they were more
exactly.
related to Egypt and Asia Minor. So this argument of Western values is based on this really Northern European aspect. So even this, I would point out, is kind of fault. And actually, this is a really, because I'm from the northern part of Greece, which was a region that remained into the Ottoman Empire for a bigger quantity of time.
Right.
It was actually intervention from the UK and France to eradicate all of the minor languages that existed in the areas, to create this ideal image of the Greeks as direct descendants of the classics.
Sure.
And yeah, that's the point.
Well, yeah, no,
I'm not disagreeing with anything you said.
No, but no, I think
trying
it's
to
important
point
because what it emphasizes is the whole centrality of the formation of modern nation states, which since the 1800s, 18th century, which require the idea of some sort of homogeneous. The population must almost speak the same language, and they must all have the same culture and so on. And I think what you're saying is right. I mean, Herodotus, when he wrote his histories, 7 of the 9 books were devoted to Persia and Egypt, because they were considered the most advanced civilizations back then in the ancient Greek world. So it's to do with this sort of whitening of European history, and Greek history is very much part of that, the formation of modern nation-state of Greece, which involved the idea of whitening it and the idea of its pure origins of the West. But central to that is the modern nation-state, which requires homogeneity, linguistically, culturally, historically. So any differences must be eradicated, even exterminated.
They were exterminated.
Yeah, I know.
Murdered, etc.
I know.
Some other question. We have still 5, maybe 10 if you want, but not more. There is a question, and there we can take 2 at the same time.
Yeah, sure.
If you doesn't mind, you just do.
Yeah, sure.
For the time.
If my mind can stretch.
It's just a short question. Thank you for the interesting literature. I'm Barbara. I'm a student of the Master in Migration Studies. And you stated that Arabic was the first, or is seen as the first language of the Mediterranean.
Yeah.
And I was curious how you would place the Amazigh languages in that framework,
Yeah,
or
sure.
whether you see Arabic as more a unifying language. That was my curiosity. Yeah.
Maybe we take another one. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for the interesting insights. My name is Lara. I'm also from the same Migration Masters. And I was wondering, when we talk about Europe, then it seems to be very much like, or as already mentioned, like Northern Europe, or also, I don't know, maybe Southern Europe, but then Eastern Europe, so the Balkans are rarely taken into account. And I'm not asking you to speak in, like in their position, but like maybe you know about how authors from the Balkans actually positioning themselves in this whole question of Europe and the Mediterranean and like the global north and subaltern south.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, the first one, that first question, of course, I think even if you remove all the Berber languages and dialects, Arabic would still be the most dominant language. And of course, there's a history there about colonization, Arab colonization of Berber culture and history, much deeper history. But I think, anyway, I mean, I was making a very vague point, and you're quite right to tell me off. Okay, and then the Balkans. Yeah, I've been involved in a project called Geophilosophy of the Balkans the last 4 years, because I think it's thinking about the Balkans, because the way it has always been rendered peripheral in terms of Occidental modernity. Bram Stoker, Dracula, all that. Anyway, but more than that, about thinking about the whole question of violence in the Balkans, how that has always been exercised in the modern period through the national state form. So the struggle over nation states, the imposing of ideas again of homogeneous identities, homogeneous belonging, which on the ground doesn't exist. You can even go to a very tiny country like Macedonia, or which the Greeks insist is Macedonia of the North. You know, there's not a single linguistic community, there's not a single ethnic community, there's not a single religious community. So it, in a way, becomes a way of, I think about it as a laboratory of modernity, because it throws critical light back upon Europe. Europe, which always insists about modern identities, homogeneous nation-state, and what you see on the ground in the Balkans, which you see everywhere in Europe if you look for it, is a much more complicated, heterogeneous hybrid formation, like back in ancient Greece. It was all about hybrid formation of what we call ancient Greece. Its language, linguistically, and so on. And I think the same in the Balkans. So I'm interested, I've been involved thinking about the Balkans, not simply about is less modern or so on, but no, it's precisely, it raises all questions about modernity. Whose modernity is it? How do you understand you live modernity? I live in a city which is often considered to be on the edges of modernity, Naples. But I say to people, come, yeah, but you know, it has these ancient rites, pre-Christian rituals, and high-speed trains. So it's a complicated modernity. It's much more complicated in a single homogeneous version. And I think what's happened in the Balkans is, of course, very much a fallout of European colonial imperial powers. What happened, the same with the making, what happened in northern Greece. So I think it's a much more complicated history, which throws, what I think is important, it throws critical light back upon Europe. It's not simply a problem in the Balkans, but it's actually raising questions about how Europe has made itself in a certain way, and the fallout from that, which may be the Balkans, what happened in ex-Yugoslavia in the 1990s, what's been happening in Palestine, Israel over the last 70 years. All that part of that fallout from European understandings and politics, of course, and power.
Maybe another round, and Rafik, and somebody else, last, okay.
Oh, yeah, perfect.
I put myself also. Okay.
Yeah, I'm Rafik.
Then two more rounds, 2 and 2. Okay. Sorry, Rafik.
No, don't worry. I'm Rafik. I'm postdoctoral researcher at the GRITIM-UPF. So thanks a lot for your wonderful presentation. As I'm a geographer, so I'm super interested by maps, and I am super happy to see radical cartography from Filip Rekašivic. And so I was wondering, is it not a coloniality to just limit the Mediterranean Sea between the river from the north and the river from the south, because it's the power of the map that give us a kind of opinion that the Mediterranean is closed. But we can see in the map of Filip Rekašivic that the Mediterranean is super interrelated with countries like as Niger or Ivory Coast. How do you think that we can, of course, open our minds and our borders from the Mediterranean, and to talk on the Mediterranean without only talking on Arabic, Amazigh language, or Greece, or Algeria, or only the countries that are that we know. So,
sure.
Thanks.
Another question there? There were.
Yeah, I mean, you make like this.
No, I think we need macro because there are people listening from.
Okay, hi, I'm Maria Paula. I'm from the International Studies Master. My question is about the latest decision of the European Commission regarding the migration pact reached in Granada. So I was wondering, what's your forecast? How do you see the approach, since, of course, the determination they took, externalizing borders and militarized border and encourage Frontex, how this is going to impact actually in the Mediterranean? Of course, I'm not speaking mostly on the European part of the Mediterranean, but from the other side, which is the most affected, and it's being treated like a crisis, which is not precisely a crisis. It's something that is been going on and will keep happening and will just cost more lives, as we've been seeing for the latest years. So what's your opinion on it?
Yeah, okay, wow. Okay. So, the thing about the maps, of course, the maps
provoke big questions.
Yeah, the maps, they're, how can I put it? They're two-dimensional all the time. They're always two-dimensional. And then, so the first thing to do is introduce other maps, as you suggested. And when we start introducing other maps, we go off the map, we go off the European map, and we find ourselves in other spaces. So that stratification, sedimentation of the other maps is very important, and also to register precisely that the power of maps, are maps of power. So understanding that the mapping is not a neutral scientific process, so it's presented as that. The measurement of the world is always who's measuring the world, according to who's looking, what sort of questions they're bringing to bear to map. So maps are very complicated instruments of power, and also very complicated intellectual and cultural forces. So maps of power, the power of maps. So certainly I agree with what you're saying. And the Mediterranean then becomes something much more complicated and takes us to the Balkans, to the Caucasus, to the steppes, or south of sub-Saharan Africa, into sub-Saharan Africa and so on. So that's very complicated. I agree with all that. And that's partly I try to show in that map of 13th century world system, which introduces the Mediterranean as part of a so-called world system of the 13th century, linking Marrakesh to Beijing. So on one hand. And the other thing is about European Frontex, and to think about migration. Of course, I agree. I always refuse the idea that migration is a crisis question. It's a structural question. So, and also, Europeans forget, that Europeans have been doing it for centuries without asking permission for anybody. It's only in the early 20th century the United States started imposing migrant controls of people coming from Europe. But Europeans have been doing it for centuries. So migration is more about a question of rights rather than about a question of migration as a thing, because it's always happening. And it's a structural reality. So in a way, as I tried to say at the beginning, migration is a history of modernity. And of course, when we say migration, we're not just talking about bodies moving around the world. We're talking about histories, cultures, languages. So it's an invitation to think about the mobility induced by migration is the name of modernity. And we all, the people in power are quite happy when that means the mobility or the migration of capital and goods, but not when it involves people, bodies, and other languages and other cultures. So, but one comes with the other. If you want a global world of globalization and movement of capital everywhere, you have to accept the other is going to happen as well. Why not? Because people live and move in the same imaginary as well. People who migrate from Senegal to Italy or France or whatever, they've watched the same TV channels, they have cell phones, etc., etc. They're hooked into in their own different ways, but they're part of a shared cultural mediascape as well. So their imaginations are not completely separate. They come with other questions, other needs, but within the same languages of modernity. So I agree. The European Union's got no answer to it. It won't have, because the European Union, in the end, if you look at it, if you're really blunt about it, it's about white supremacy. How to preserve white supremacy. The White House and all that. Okay. So, but that's the question. But I think critically we have to be aware of that, and so registering those limits.
Okay, we take extra time now.
Gemma
wanted to ask something, and I will leave my question because of time. Okay.
You have time, Ricard.
You have time?
My question, I think you start to answer the question with your last remark, but I will try to make me understood by the question. I thank you very much for your exposition. With Elisabetta, we try here at the Institute to open minds also, because, as a think tank, we are trying to look the things from a structural way, right. Politics in one part, sociology in another, culture in another, and we try to convince everyone that culture matters. I will just make a question, not to be answered, but because the suggestion. In the construction of this Mediterranean imaginarium, or area, or region, and this is the question, you raise the issue of culture, you raise the issue of diversity, and the human, let me say, dimension through migration and through this approach. How can we define now our object or subject of a study that is the Mediterranean from this point of view? Because I think your suggestion about, for example, taking culture, culture is something that passed in the history, but you finish with a creativity dimension. So we are constructing continuously this imaginarium of the Mediterranean. We have this drama in Palestine now, or also in the human beings, and we have this black human situation. And we talk about diversity. There is 15, 20 years ago, our idea of Mediterranean is based on the diversity. Why we are Mediterraneans, why we are taking this, because we are diverse, we are not homogeneous. But it is much more complex than this. So, briefly, do you consider that Mediterranean is an object and subject of study nowadays? Or do you consider that just we are taking this as a part of the world and the global problematics that we have here, and we try to understand better what is happening here? Because we truly believe, I truly believe, that it does exist. I don't know why. And I try to understand now, by culture mainly, why this creativity seems to me is a Mediterranean question. Why we share something in the Mediterranean region. Of course, this is a reflection, it's not a question only, but I'm very much interested to understand your opinion.
We need an ontology of Mediterranean, no?
Okay.
But you have the last words.
Well, there's no last word, but I think the answer is it's both. You can't think about the Mediterranean, and here I'm quoting the Italian communist intellectual Antonio Gramsci. You can't think about the specificity of the Mediterranean without thinking globally. It's evolved because we know since 1500, 1600, we're all interconnected at a planetary level. The problem is about registering what that means in a more complicated way. The thing about culture, and this again is a very Gramscian argument, everything passes through culture, whether it's politics, economics, because it passes through language. If we don't have language, we can't signify, we can't nominate what we're talking about. So everything passes through culture. So this separation out, which we do in our specializations, this is about politics, this is about literature, it's about history, it's anthropology. When you come down to it, it's all being mediated and transformed, configured through culture. We can never get to politics as though it's naked and pure, or the human as though it's naked and pure. We only get to it through language, so we're always constructing through culture. So culture is the platform of politics, and that's what a lot of people tend to forget. So I think that's the real point, is about it all occurs within culture, within the languages at our disposition. And having said that, that's why I insist, or try to bring to the forefront, thinking with other languages which tend not to be considered to be political, such as music, or the visual arts. I think looking at the visual arts in the Mediterranean, you find a whole political and historical and critical undertaking being elaborated through the visual arts as well, which we're taught to think about the visual arts and music simply as illustrations of history or culture or history occurring elsewhere. But I'm making an argument that actually it's occurring there in the very languages of the visual arts and music. It's all political, but of course it's through culture that it comes. It's the only way we can apprehend it.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. The Aula Mediterrània is now open.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay.
Va bene? Okay.
Yeah, I think so, yeah. That was the purpose, yeah, to open. Come.
Drinks. Forse devo annunciare. You need to announce the drinks.
Els meus sí. Els meus sí. Bueno, suposo que sí. Si no ens quedem aquí en les ampolles i fem una festa nosaltres.